When our board meets, we meet twice a year as a board, and when we meet, at the very beginning of our meeting, we're in flight all over again. And this is a group that's met together for years, because every time a system comes together to form itself, it has to form itself. That means it has to manage that little flurry of fight and manage the early phase dynamics to put itself back into work. And that happens all the time. It happens in therapy groups. Whenever a therapy group gets together, even if it's once a week, you'll see right at the beginning of the therapy group, there'll often be a flurry into flight. And then the group sort of gets through it pretty quickly, because it's not really where it is. It's just where the reality of the system is at that moment. Yeah. So let me talk about these phases just a little bit more. The whole first phase of authority, the relationship with the leader is, as people are working together in the group, and as they're subgrouping, they have one eye on the leader. And my favorite story about this was a long-term SCT colleague was taking up a role in a basic training weekend. And he said, I was really intent that I wasn't going to look at the leader, because he knew all the research. And he knew all the research that in the first phase of development, one looks at the leader. And he said, I was really absolutely determined I wasn't going to look at the leader. And, he says, I couldn't help it. Okay. So that is the pull of the phase, which is bigger than individual intentions. That's the pull of the phase. It's bigger than the personal intentions we might have. Because in the first phase, the preoccupation is with the authority and the leader. And the outcome of undoing the flight is we get reality established in the group. The outcome of undoing the fight restraining forces or defenses is we start to recognize the real differences, and we start to tell the difference between our reaction to difference and the difference itself. And the difference itself has the knowledge and information in it and the energy for the group. And then as we undo the role locks, we start to undo the predictable role pairings, one up, one down, that keep us from making the peer relationships that enable us to do our work together. And as we go through the crisis of hatred, we have the fundamental issues that we have with external authority. Now, the pathway through each of those phases has lots of things in it. So the pathway through flight is we undo all the anxiety and fears, and we start to create really what we call functional subgroup systems, which are also secure systems for exploration. And we start to free the capacity to explore in the here and now, instead of time travel to the past or the future. The clinical language is we are undoing what we call the hierarchy of defense modification. So the hierarchy of defense modification is linked to the phases of development. And we undo certain defenses in certain phases. We do not undo defenses that are harder and more complex to undo until we've undone the earlier defenses. And a really good example of that is we undo in the very first phase, the flight phase, we undo the negative predictions. And we undo the cognitive defenses where we are generating our experience through our thinking, different than being able to have the spontaneous human experience that comes from living in the here and now. Everybody know that one? Okay. Now, outrage comes in the fight phase. We undo outrage in the fight phase. If we try to undo outrage before we've undone the cognitive defenses, the group will really have a difficult time, because outrage is based on the idea of already knowing that the experience is being generated by a thought. Because outrage is experience being generated by thoughts and righteous indignation, instead of opening up and centering into the profound depths of one's rage and anger. So outrage takes it into a cognitively generated experience, different than a primary here and now emotional experience. And so if we try to undo outrage before the groups learn the difference between those two experiences, which one learns in the flight phase, we will have given the group an impossible task. Like if you'll notice in SCT, we don't ask people at the beginning of a group to introduce themselves. Because what happens when we introduce ourselves in a group right at the beginning, when the group's in flight, we start to make a status hierarchy based on social stereotypes and outside roles, instead of making here and now membership relationships. So if you'll notice all week, you probably haven't been in a group where anyone's introduced themselves at the beginning. And that's really very intentional, because that is working to weaken the natural social defenses and stereotypes we put into place all the time at the beginning of a developing system. And we put them into place because it puts us back in something we know. And a brand new system is something we don't know. And as human beings, we're not so comfortable, any of us, with what we don't know. And remember, one never knows what's going to be a driving force or a restraining force until you're clear on the goal of the context. Because something that's a driving force in one context will easily be a restraining force in another, depending on the role, goal, and context. You have to be always aware of your context, the goal of your context, to be able to judge whether the input you're making as a member is going to be driving or restraining. And if you don't know that, then you have no way to orient towards whether it's driving or restraining. So as we move through flight, by weakening the social defenses, the ambiguity, the contradiction, the redundancy, by weakening the negative predictions, by weakening explanations and creating a culture of exploration, the group then starts to recognize the reality of the real differences that exist in the group. And as soon as we recognize, as soon as we're no longer avoiding the differences that are present in the here and now, not the stereotyped ones, but the present in the here and now differences, then we start to have the reaction to the differences. And that starts initially in frustration. And the challenge when the frustration starts to come in is how to help the group gain enough capacity to make room for its frustration and to be able to have the experience of the natural free energy that's in frustration when there's enough space for it. Because frustration often gets very bad press. And frustration actually is energy that is not yet connected to a goal. So the issue is, how do we make room for our frustration, legitimize it, not assume that because we're frustrated something is wrong. And we sometimes say that that initial irritability is a sign of life energy, because it actually is. And so that once we start to get room for the frustration, the next defense that we're modifying or restraining force that we're reducing, and I'm using both languages here. So if I'm talking in an organizational context, I'm going to be talking restraining forces. If I'm talking in a training group or a clinical context, I can talk modifying the defenses, and I mean the same thing. So the next defense we're going to modify would be the tension. And remember, what happens is, as frustration gets big enough, we start to tense against it. And the important discrimination we make in that phase of development is that there's a difference between frustration and tension. And once we've made that discrimination, then we have the techniques for undoing tension, standing in the shower or going inside to see what's there. And that is starting to restore the group's relationship with the emotional, sensate, and bodily knowledge, because the tension is restricting the flow of the information we get from our bodies. The tension is restricting it. And in clinical groups, we would also at that point begin working some with the psychosomatic defenses, which is a more complex response to the frustration and more of the discharge into the body. And we work with it, though, at that same phase to restore the relationship with the body. But the sort of simple prototype is undoing the tension and regaining the capacity to track one's bodily experience, to get the sensate knowledge that underlies the feelings and emotions that we can then continue to access, to gain access to our energy and information that we have as people and then as members of the system.